for almost 70 years, we've had very good evidence about instructional practices for rehabilitating individuals with autism spectrum disorders, including infants, young children, adolescents, and adults. My primary purpose today in this lecture is to discuss the importance of evidence-based practice and to define evidence-based practice in a way that allows us to continue to evolve the work that we do that develops better strategies for treatment, but in particular develops strategies for treatment that we can be confident in their effectiveness. So what I'd like to do initially is to talk to you about some of the things that are the most important things for us to consider, but also to begin with a comment from the former late director of the Child Studies Center at Yale. And it's the problem we all suffer with, those of us that are practitioners, but also mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters of an individual with autism. And specifically, we don't have a cure, so we have 1,000 treatments. The problem we face as practitioners in autism is that we have 1,000 treatments. The advantage we have is that we have science. So what I'd like to focus on for the remainder of my opportunity with you today is to talk with you about how we develop our science.
È importante per vedere come sviluppiamo noi gli aspetti scientifici a nostra disposizione.
And how we think about the development of science over time.
Allo sviluppo della scienza nel corso del tempo.
When we consider evidence-based practice,
Quella che noi consideriamo una pratica basata sulle evidenze,
we always have the opportunity to begin with the theoretical.
È qualche cosa che deve partire dagli aspetti teorici.
When we have a clinical issue, is there a mechanism of action that we can attribute
abbiamo un aspetto
and relate?
clinico, dobbiamo avere una teoria che crea poi un rapporto tra i.
The process of science takes us from a theoretical construct to basic research. As an example, there are some very important studies at the basic research level that are being conducted now on eye tracking and the developmental psychopathology of the use of gaze in infants as young as 2 months of age. This basic science will lead to interventions that will then begin to look at the trajectory of the use of gaze in infants and toddlers in an effort to try to change that trajectory. This research is being conducted in a number of centers throughout the United States and in Europe. One of the more prominent centers is at Yale, but also at the Emory Autism Research Center in Atlanta. Once we move from basic research and we have an understanding of mechanism of action, we move into preliminary outcome research. Many years ago, the Early Start Denver model engaged in that level of analysis and then was able to generate process outcome connections. In other words, does the intervention lead to the hypothesized outcome with a degree of reliability? This is the critical point in the investigation of all science, not just in science and autism. For 60 years, we have a progression of expanding science in evidence-based practice in treating autism.
Allora, negli ultimi 60 anni si è sviluppato molto il trattamento basato sull'evidenza per il trattamento di soggetti con spettro autistico.
The first phase investigated the most basic problems that were being confronted by parents and professionals. For example, problems with severe behavior and significant learning issues.
La prima fase riguarda dell'analisi sperimentale e è portata alla comprensione di tutti gli aspetti che saranno importanti.
The second phase looked at extending those basic findings so they were generalizable, could be sustained, and could be implemented fluently by parents and teachers alike.
La seconda fase è quella che porta alla generalizzazione, al mantenimento e all'acquisizione delle abilità acquisite appunto dai soggetti con spettro autistico.
Very importantly, in the second phase, the emphasis was placed on translational science. it was placed on making science in treating autism more broadly available and more sustainable.
L'importante poi è stato quello di rendere più ampiamente disponibile e sostenibile il risultato degli studi.
The third phase is where we currently exist today. We're currently involved in the process of expanding the translation of science, similar to what Giacomo Vivante was discussing for Australia in the Early Start Denver model, into broad application.
Come ha detto Giacomo Vivanti, la terza fase riguarda poi la traduzione in concetti molto più ampi da applicare nella pratica.
But very importantly, and I believe that it's part of the emphasis of this conference, it's the translation of science into public policy.
Ma quello che è importante qui è la traduzione della scienza nella politica pubblica.
The guidelines that have been established, that you'll be discussing throughout today, have codified, have solidified the evidence-based practices into a series of procedures that should be available to all individuals with autism spectrum disorders.
Le linee guida sono state poi codificate in pratica che dovranno essere disponibili a favore di tutte le persone con spettro autistico.
You will hear much more about those guidelines for treatment from other speakers today. But one of the important points that I would bring to you is that those guidelines that have been developed in Italy are consistent with guidelines that exist in the United States, also in Europe, and represent the same level of meta-analysis.
Di linee guida parleremo moltissimo qui. Un aspetto importante è capire la coerenza tra le linee guida che sono applicate in Italia, negli Stati Uniti o negli altri paesi europei e soprattutto a livello di meta-analisi.
Should I tell them? The first nearly 30 years of the application of evidence-based science in autism brought very important evidence-based treatments into common practice. The critical problem was that they weren't commonly used. So we have good procedures that were not widespread. But during this period of time, we have developed a technology for toilet training. We've developed a technology for understanding and treating self-injury and aggression, vocal speech, for treating problem behavior with communication training. We've developed a technology of generalizing a skill that was taught in one setting to broader settings, and we've developed technologies for academic instruction. Now, when I talk about these technologies, these are specific procedures that work. These are not ideas that might work. When used correctly, these are instructional or treatment procedures that have tremendous research behind them and should be broadly applicable. But we're only going back a quarter of a century in order to even discuss this. We then move forward to an important change. I would argue a paradigm shift that occurred in the late 1980s, and it was the publication of the first article on early intervention and cognitive changes in individuals with autism. And it was the study published on a very small number of students by Ivar Lovas. The opportunity that this particular inquiry provided was that it also provided chaos. It was both a scientific breakthrough and a cultural violation. What it did was challenge the existing to move beyond. You should know that there was a great deal of controversy even in publishing this particular paper, and it was initially rejected. The editor of the journal overrode the editorial board and decided to publish the article for purposes of generating additional research and discussion. The most important thing that happened was that there was additional discussion, because science is based on additional inquiry. So from this one opportunity, We had a variety of different treatment options. If I were to tell you that Lovaas therapy is something that you may have heard of in Italy, I certainly have in Italy, you would recognize that it represents a single way of thinking, not the broad range of behavior analysis that I'll be discussing today. But it's important to know that we came from here. It's also important to know that this particular paper that was published generated cultural and social and political discussion. It was translated in many ways by a book, Let Me Hear Your Voice, published in 1993, and that described the intervention using applied behavior analysis in developing vocal speech in children of the author. There is a saying, the plural of anecdote is not evidence-based. And what we mean by that is that many good stories of success do not generate science. Many good studies of success, empirically wrought, generate good science. But it's very important for us to know why we are where we are today and why there's even discussion about this. So let me describe for you, when we talk about treatment in autism, we must talk about evidence-based practice, and I would propose that we define it in the following way. We start out with a body of scientific knowledge. We can accumulate this knowledge from various professions, but the most important thing is that it's based on the use and application of good scientific procedures. We apply those procedures to the problems that we face. In this case, the clinical problems, the educational issues of an individual who has an autism spectrum disorder. We look at the validity and the robustness of the findings in the studies. The guidelines that have been published in Italy went about a meta-analysis of all of the available research on autism treatment and created a standard algorithm for assessment of those studies in the meta-analysis and derived statements of evidence-based or probable or not evidence-based, ways of thinking about how to evaluate the efficacy and the robustness and the validity. Most importantly, any evidence-based procedure must be judged by its outcome. If it's not effective in delivering the outcome that it proposes, it is not evidence-based. That may seem like a circular argument, but it's not. It's the statement by which we evaluate what we do. If we propose an outcome and we intervene in a particular way and we don't achieve the outcome repeatedly, it didn't work for that individual and perhaps for the larger group of individuals. So we're going to be very rigid about the application of that statement. And I'll define the effectiveness statement even further by saying effective intervention produces a verifiable outcome, but it has to be developmentally valid, it has to be socially valid, and it has to be efficient and using empirically validated techniques. The importance here is the linkage between empirically validated treatments and the intervention outcome that you achieve. We want to be certain that in the application of treatment to those with autism, we don't forget that what we do must work. There are several things that we know make a difference. I'll review these very briefly with you because they're going to be discussed in greater detail, both in the guidelines and in some of the presentations later this afternoon. We start as early as possible. We don't wait until a certain age. We intervene at age of suspicion and age of identification. We have intensive intervention. The word intensive is defined by frequency, but also by accuracy. So we have lots of good teaching using empirically validated techniques across a variety of settings, across many hours of the week. Teaching opportunities are delivered frequently. They have to be delivered with redundancy. We provide adult attention systematically to facilitate those intervention opportunities. Families and parent education are integral to the process of treating children with autism. Individuals who are treated in the absence of family and community interventions fail to generalize. So we recognize that while parents may not be the professional intervenors, they are the most frequent intervenors. So they need to have the technology of intervention as well defined and as well practiced as any professional working with their daughter or son. Treatment in autism involves ongoing assessment. It is not a static linear assessment model. It is a circular model of assessment, meaning that when we assess, we hypothesize a problem and its function. We then intervene based on that hypothesis and the function. We then evaluate the effectiveness of our intervention. We then realign or change our intervention based on the resulting data that come from our evaluation models. That circular model is dynamic. It's also ongoing. It essentially means that until a skill is established for the individual and generalized to fluency, intervention hasn't been concluded. And that's the important point. It's not a linear model, it's a dynamic circular model of assessment. There are instructional priorities that range from teaching communication skills, to teaching academics, to teaching social behavior. All of these things need to be done not only in the clinical or treatment setting, but generalized to the natural environment. The instructional procedures that I just described for you were the result of 2 very large meta-analytic studies conducted in the US, very similar to the one that was done in Italy. They used an algorithm that assigned value based upon the robustness of the research methodology and the power of the outcomes, all right? The degrees of power of the findings. These were conducted in 2 different organizations over a period of time, the National Autism Center and the National Research Council. You'll find that the instructional procedures that are discussed are many. This is not limited to one set of instructional procedures. You will find that all of those instructional procedures at their very base are derived from the learning theory and the principles and practices of applied behavior analysis. This is not to say that applied behavior analysis is the only area where good research exists. It is to say that the instructional and research methodologies that are used in applied behavior analysis have generated the best outcomes for individuals with autism over a very long period of time, and together constitute the body of evidence-based practice. The problem that we have in the US, and perhaps you have in Italy, is that as soon as you call it applied behavior analysis, you have turned a good opportunity into a problem. And so what I want to do is to try to dispel some of that information for you and talk a little bit about what applied behavior analysis is, but also what it is not limited by. It's a branch of the behavioral sciences. It's one branch. There are many. But it's the branch that's derived from learning theory. And the learning theory is systematically applied. It's applied in such a way that we can look at socially important behaviors, predict the degree of change, implement those procedures, and achieve the outcome that was predicted. It's the basic application of the scientific method towards the amelioration of problems of individuals with autism. What's most important is that applied behavior analysis is derived from what you learn works, and what you learn does not work is discarded. So teaching procedures that don't work for an individual are not promoted and promulgated. They're changed. The value in the use of science here is that you can change interventions depending on the need of the individual. There is not a one-size-blanket-fits-all proposal. The problem that I confront in my own work at our center, and when I go and work in various other organizations and other countries, is that applied behavior analysis has become viewed as a very narrow, unidimensional practice. In some of the places that we work, applied behavior analysis is synonymous with discrete trial teaching. In some places, it's synonymous with verbal behavior instruction. In some places, it's synonymous with division teach. All of these are inaccurate descriptions. Applied behavior analysis is an umbrella term that is based on these principles here and these principles alone. The application of science and analysis based on learning theory. You have many different instructional procedures in the toolkit of applied behavior analysis. Strategies that are based on positive and negative reinforcement. Strategies that are based on prompting procedures. Those that are based on discrete trial teaching, but those that are also based on the use of task analysis. Verbal behavior models, incidental teaching, pivotal response training, all of these are part of applied behavior analysis. It would be a mistake to say that the correct form of applied behavior analysis is only one of these. That would be an error, and the persons who would be harmed by that error would be children. All right, that's not an acceptable outcome. It's a narrow view, and it needs to be avoided. What's most important is that practitioners, clinicians working with individuals with autism make the right choice. So if you said to me, Michael, I want to toilet train this child with autism, I will not use discrete trial teaching. It would be wrong. It's not the instructional procedure that is related to toilet training individuals with autism. Task analysis, reinforcement, shaping, fading, prompting, those are procedures that are related to toilet training. They are procedures that are part of the evidence-based practice. So we want to make our choices based on knowing the good science, but also knowing which parts of science to apply to the given situation. That's the most critical thinking part of clinical work. So we have a toolbox with many things that work. Our charge is to make sure that we use them correctly and we choose them correctly. That's not easy. The first part, using them correctly, is particularly difficult. We'll talk about that in a minute. But why is applied behavior analysis useful, and how does it work? It provides structure. The most important thing that we need in working with an individual who requires a high degree of structure is to provide structured teaching or structured intervention. The environment is thus created so the individual has fewer errors that they will possibly make, and fewer errors translates into more opportunities for correct performance and reinforcement. All of applied behavior analysis is based on learning theory. Learning theory is clearly based on the idea that behavior that is reinforced increases, whether it's reinforced externally or whether it's reinforced internally. The argument in behavior analysis for many years was that we can't know what is reinforced internally. There are studies being conducted now that are looking at the ability of certain materials to stimulate the brain during functional MRI procedures in the reinforcement centers of the brain, and the correspondence between what is described as an external reinforcer and what is actually illuminating the part of the brain that recognizes preference, choice, and reinforcement. These are the kinds of opportunities that we have ahead of us, but they humble us. They tell us we don't know everything. And it's okay not to know everything. What's important is if we don't know, we know how to investigate. Applied behavior analysis breaks complex tasks into small units. Big things become understandable and they become linked together in what's called a chain. That's how skills can be taught. Now, obviously, if we teach a skill simplistically, just in a chain, where A precedes B, which precedes C, which precedes D, we're probably going to have a problem with generalization. We're probably going to have a problem with fluency. So we want to make sure that we not only teach the skill, but we teach the application and the participation in the skill in a wide variety of settings. Behavior analysis identifies the environment for learning and says that you initially must remove the extraneous. You need to create the environment where all of the static and the noise and the irrelevancy of instruction is removed initially, so the skill can be taught and reinforced in a more black and white or a more unencumbered environment. But then you need to add back in. So if we teach skills in a way that are highly circumscribed, they'll be novel, they won't be representative of the natural environment, and they won't generalize to fluency. Behavior analysis allows us to look at problem behaviors, whether they're aggression, or ritualistic and repetitive behaviors, or self-injury, or property destruction. It allows us to look at them functionally and to say, these behaviors have purpose. We don't like those behaviors, but they are purposeful to the person with autism. What is that purpose? We intervene to teach alternatives to that purpose, called functional alternatives, in order to replace the problem with a more acceptable response. Behavior analysis gives us the tools to initially functionally evaluate and assess, then intervene to create more acceptable, adaptive alternatives. It gives us the progression of knowing, understanding, intervening, and evaluating. Behavior analysis gives us the basis for building skill repertoires. From teaching a small skill that is then the foundation for a pyramid of skills that are built and expanded. The Early Start Denver model is based on several concepts that very clearly articulate this. It's built on approach. It's built on social engagement. It's built on developing a reinforcing relationship between the child and the parent and the child and therapists, so that on top of that relationship, you can make demands and build new skills. Now, guess what? Verbal behavior models are also based on that same premise. They go about it in a slightly different way. Okay? Pivotal response training is based on exactly that same premise and goes about it with a slightly different set of procedures. But if you put the procedures aside and you strip this down to its basic element, you recognize that behavior analysis begins instruction, intervention with a child by having the child learn that a person is valuable. Because in autism, that isn't always the case. But in human interaction, it is the most essential element. Behavior analysis, therefore, doesn't in any way dehumanize, it humanizes. It starts with the idea that people are the most important thing in your world. We have had a lot of reasons that applied behavior analysis has not done so well with its acceptance. Some of it has been stubbornness. Some of it has been that the availability of trained interventionists has been in short supply. We just started a program, a project, my center, in Kazakhstan. We started last week. In Kazakhstan, there are no teachers who have any training in behavior analysis. There are no teachers who have specific training in autism. There is no institution or university to train teachers in autism or behavior analysis. Fortunately, through a network of professionals and parents, several of my staff speak Russian and have an interest in Kazakhstan. And so there's a project going on that starts at the most basic level of teaching teachers to teach children correctly. That is not a small task, especially not a small task where the baseline is very, very low. But it's a very exciting task because we're bringing a technology to a place. Now, you can pick places in the United States where the same problem exists. We have great need, we have very few practitioners. You can find places in Italy where that's the case. You can also find places in Italy where this is not the problem, where we have terrific practitioners. There are things that we as behavior analysts do to create our own problems as well. We create false dichotomies. We say, discrete trial teaching is better than verbal behavior. We say pivotal response training is the answer to everyone's prayers. We say you should never use verbal behavior. We say you should always use verbal behavior. These are self-inflicted wounds. But the problem is that they confuse parents and they polarize professionals. That is not good. Step back. We should be able to say any intervention where the evidence is robust, where the science is good, should be available in the toolbox to treat children with autism. Strategies that don't have the evidence currently should be able to be evaluated against those standards of behavioral science to establish the evidence base. That would be good practice. Rather than abandoning sensory-based interventions in autism, evaluate them. Evaluate them comprehensively. I'm certain that there are elements of importance in treatment that exist in that particular field. The fact that we don't have substantial body of research to support it is a problem for us, but it's not an unsolvable problem. So I would propose that if we come back to the basics of evaluating rigorously what we do, we have the ability to expand the toolbox, to reach more children, to train more practitioners. The problem of whose science is best plagues all of us. Anyone here in any discipline who operates in science, whether it's genetics, it's microbiology, it's physical medicine, or it's the treatment of autism, has to deal with the problem of how robust are the research methods. We have standards for evaluating that. The meta-analysis that was conducted to develop your guidelines in autism in Italy proposed a set of standards that should be very useful in evaluating future treatments, whether people have sufficient procedural reliability and validity, whether they have sufficient instructional methodologies, whether they have a large enough population sample of children who were part of the research studies. It's important that we do this. It's also important that we keep the window open to other disciplines, that we allow other information to enter our thinking. Narrow-mindedness has plagued treatment of autism for 100 years. Open-mindedness will be its long-term solution. Mindless open-mindedness will be its downfall. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we stay rigorous, but that we stay open. And then we also want to be certain that we adhere, that we religiously adhere to the idea that if it didn't work, it needs to be changed. And that's always a hallmark of what we know how to do well. The problem that we're running into right now is that as we know more, we use it less. And that's a long-term issue that we're going to have to confront as we move over time. The idea that we have a good science and the idea that we are not using it sufficiently is a huge issue that we have to be able to bridge and be able to confront and overcome. If we're going to do this, if we're going to use evidence-based practice well, we're going to make it organic and integrated into the natural communities and environments where that science is practiced. Families have to be initially and ongoing involved in the implementation and evaluation. When we think of schools and we think of applying applied behavior analysis and good instruction to children, we have to be sure that we recognize that it's part of the education of all children, not separated into just education for children with autism. We have to make sure that those who administer programs value these interventions. We have to provide expertise in understanding, training, and evaluating the effectiveness of teachers and clinicians, as well as the effectiveness of the outcomes of the interventions with the children. And technical assistance is often the way to do this. In most of our models, we use a pyramidal training protocol, which means we train a small group who then train other groups, who then disseminate to tertiary groups, all the while ensuring that those groups are operating at a high level of integrity for the interventions. We differentiate training based upon needs, we give performance feedback, and we also make sure that we exit quickly. Planning the obsolescence, exiting the need for consultation is a sustainable model, but it also allows for the capacity of the organization to be built. I'm going to leave you with a couple guidelines. There's a lot of pseudoscience that we hear about. When there's no cure, there's 1,000 treatments. But how do you evaluate the 999? What do you look for? I'm going to give you some thoughts. The first thing is scientifically sound treatment has either randomly assigned participants or single-subject experimental designs that are known to be effective in evaluating outcomes, not only in autism. So we're using basic science here. This is part of the algorithm in your guidelines. If there are large enough samples, we have statistical analysis. Standardized measures are used for diagnosis. That's not unimportant. Part of the problem we're having in the US right now is that the prevalence rates are increasing about every year. The most recent figure is less than 1 in 88. Last year it was 1 in 88. The year before it was 1 in 110. Now we're operating somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 in about 60. Do we have a true prevalence increase, or do we have an over-identification? The problem is probably because of the absence of well-utilized standardized measures in identifying autism spectrum disorders to a small degree, okay? So I can't emphasize enough that you need to know the population you're looking at. But you have to use validated outcome measures. They have to be reliable. Behavioral methodologies, behavioral science gives us observational methods that can be validated and can be deemed to be reliable or unreliable, and those are the ones that we should depend upon. A very important but underutilized concept is called treatment integrity. Treatment integrity simply means you did what you were supposed to do. If I have a treatment procedure and it has 10 steps, where each of those steps delivered accurately, you would be surprised how poor treatment integrity studies can be. You would also be surprised how you can train for treatment integrity using very good instructional methods, and you will get better outcomes, better generalization, greater fluency, and reduced reliance on adults, instructors, with high treatment integrity. All of those things, all positive things. But without treatment integrity, we have drift. We have children who have different instructional relationships in different environments, and they don't generalize. The most robust study are the ones that are generally done in the physical sciences, which are double-blind, crossover, placebo studies. We don't do these very often in autism, except in psychopharmacologic studies. And you can imagine why it's difficult. If you're teaching a child with autism and they've learned a skill, and you take away the contingencies of learning, the skill may maintain because you've done a good job. So it's very hard to reverse treatment in autism. We have other experimental designs to help us with that. I'll leave you with a couple things to consider. How do you know whether science is good? Pseudoscience is all around us. Before I leave tomorrow morning, there will be something new on the internet for curing autism. Okay? And By the time I get back, 10 hours later to my home, there'll be yet something else. It'll probably be published in Oprah or some news show in the morning that gets a lot of attention from millions of viewers who aren't thinking about science. It's the worst thing that could happen to us, but it's happening all the time. So I want you to know what to look for. Does the evidence that supports the treatment rely on some personal experience? An individual who has been doing this treatment for a long time and has lots of people who provide anecdotes of its success. The word anecdote and personal experience alone should be enough to give you caution. Is it disconnected from a scientific model? We have a gut-brain hypothesis that has been promulgated for years that what you eat causes your autism. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, especially now, as you heard in this morning's lecture, because we now know that there are changes that are observed in the earliest months of life that will ultimately lead to the progression of symptoms that may be associated with autism spectrum disorders. Can you find a treatment that cannot be tested? If the treatment cannot be tested or disproved, it should be a red flag. One of the most obvious examples of this in the world is facilitated communication, because when it's tested, it is then determined to be untestable. Are there contradictory findings that are simply ignored? We have interventions that have been used for decades where the actual investigation of those interventions has provided incontrovertible conclusions that it doesn't work. Yet that information is not factored into the thinking and the utility. And if you have disconfirming evidence, is it ignored completely? Is the scientific evidence ignored? That's not a good thing. When we have treatment claims that cannot be replicated. Many years ago in physics, we had cold fusion. Cold fusion couldn't be replicated. Cold fusion is now in the dustbin of science history. We need to make sure that those kinds of cold fusion experiences that we have in autism treatment are also not promulgated because they can't be replicated. Treatment that's based on claims about described outcomes, those kinds of outcomes that say, if you do this, this will make a difference. In all children with autism, regardless of severity, regardless of age. Those are really problematic phrases. Those are watchwords for pseudoscience. And then finally, if you only have a holistic global view of the autism spectrum disorder, your child will be treated and cured. To be honest with you, if it were all that simple, we would be doing it all ourselves. Autism is complex. It changes. This is a developmental psychopathology. It is not unitary. It requires a vision of the autism at the moment of the child's life, not autism as a unified construct that never changes over the 70 or 80 years of an individual's lifespan. So the way autism presents is different over time. Our interventions must reflect an understanding of those differences. I'm just going to move to this. I would suggest you do the following things. Demand that procedures be used correctly. How do you know they're correct? There is a literature. The scientific literature on treatment of autism is clear. Make the demand. Demand that it be used consistently. Insist on assessment. If it's your child, insist on being told what will change, why it will change, and then the evidence for it changing be developed and shown with you. In all of our work, transparency of our data is essential. Require that that functional evaluation of outcomes be insisted and that social validation of goals be demanded. Thank you.